everyone. Seems like it's a long time since we've assembled here for these lectures. We will be doing a series of 3 lectures on the laity, and I chose this time of the year and this topic because of the major synod in Rome that occurred during the month of October, which was devoted to the whole question of the laity. And the topic for tonight, chosen long before the synod ever began, has something to do with laity and the notion of hope in the church. Well, if you follow the news reports at all of what went on at the synod, you would see the irony of that topic, because in general, there's a strong feeling that things did not go well at the synod, and that there was a great deal of disappointment connected with it, and so on. And I will be talking more about that as we go along. So my task was to try to figure out how to bring out a measure of hope in the midst of a very difficult synod, one that did not seem to offer a great deal of hope. So I have decided on a particular way of doing this. We will see how this works out. I want to address the topic through the eyes of a particular person, and that is, her name is Patricia Jones. Now, Patricia Jones is not as famous as Karl Rahner, I suppose, but or other people, but she is an important person. And Patricia Jones was one of many people who were consulted, lay people consulted ahead of time to before this synod ever started. She's among or listed with 200,000 people here in the United States, lay people who were talked to by our bishops in one way or another. Their opinion was solicited so as to get input and ideas about this synod on the question of the laity in Rome. 200,000 people involved in the consultation in the United States. Well, Patricia Jones happens to be from Liverpool, England. And Patricia was one of those consulted there to find out her views about the laity in the church. Now, beyond that, Patricia was invited to go to the synod. She was one of 60 lay auditors, as they called them, invited to sit in on all of the sessions during the month of October with about 230 bishops. And not only that, but she was invited to speak at this synod, and to carry it even further, while each of the bishops was given 8 minutes to speak, she was given 20 minutes to address the group. So obviously Patricia Jones is a very important person in this whole story of the synod. Now, Patricia was 31 years old, the youngest of all of the lay auditors and the youngest person attending this synod. She lives in a very, what should we say? She had a word for it. I can't think of it, but a difficult area in Liverpool. Liverpool's an industrial city, and she lived in sort of a ghettoized kind of area, economically depressed and so on. And she worked for the church and is involved in formation teams, forming lay people, helping them to get involved in collaborative ministries for the well-being of the church. So Patricia brought a great deal of experience to this job of talking to the bishops at the synod. When you looked at the composition of the people that she was addressing, I'm presuming that the Pope was among those that listened to her. I'm not totally certain of that, but during the first part of the synod, the first week, when various people were allowed to talk to the whole group, the Pope was there listening in general to what was going on. After the first week or so, the synod broke up into small groups according to languages and discussed matters, specific questions in their small language groups. And at that time, the Pope was no longer present in the synod and was waiting to get the recommendations that came from these small groups. They were to give him ideas on writing a document that he probably will write sometime in the next 6 months or so. So Patricia was there addressing the Pope, and about, I'm thinking 220 bishops, something like that. Now about 100, these numbers are a little vague in my mind, but 150 bishops or so, I think, were representing bishops' conferences. Like we had 4 bishops from the United States elected by all the other bishops to represent them. That was Bishop May from St. Louis and Cardinal Bernardine from Chicago, and who else? Rembert Weekland, the Bishop of Milwaukee, one who had spoken out. You remember when the Pope was here, he spoke out, especially on the women's question, and that was his job in the Synod to speak up for women in the United States. Now, and who else? So yeah, it was a Bishop Ott from Baton Rouge who was also there. So we had 4 elected, and then the Pope appointed some other ones. Now, and so we had a sort of representative grouping in one way. The bishops' conferences from around the world all elected a number of their own number to be there to represent. But on the other hand, the Pope had a right to pick, I think, about 15% of the people there, and so he picked some rather conservative bishops here from the United States, Roger Mahoney from Los Angeles being maybe one example. So this is the group that Patricia is addressing when she gets her big opportunity of 20 minutes to talk. So she began, very interesting, autobiographically by telling them a little bit about herself. She talked about her own formation. She grew up in that observe, judge, and act mold. Some people know that from Catholic Christian Family Movement and the YCS, a whole bunch of movements that were based on that one principle that you were supposed to observe the scene, and then you were to make judgments about it, and then you were to act on it, to try to do something about it. Many people remember the CFM movement from years ago, where that was the whole premise. A lot of good things were done. I mean, people might gather and observe the housing situation in the community and then make a judgment about one thing they could do to try to improve it, and then they would get a collaborative effort to work on it. Well, anyway, Patricia grew up in this atmosphere. I'm going to have to keep filling in for people who come in, because otherwise you're not going to get this. I'm talking about Patricia Jones, the famous, she's not famous at all, if you don't recognize her. But anyway, Patricia Jones was invited to the Bishop's Synod in Rome and had an opportunity to speak to the bishops and the Pope from Liverpool, England. So she was formed in a good Catholic family and went through this YCS, Young Christian Student plan, and learned a lot about her faith that way. And then, interestingly enough, Patricia decided that she would go study theology. So she went and got some degrees and went to the university to try to learn about this. And as she says, I wanted to connect with what I studied with what I lived. Interesting notion she had of why she went to study theology. I wanted to be able to connect up what her studies were, her theological understanding, with the way she was living. And in fact, she got a couple of degrees, and then at the end of that time, she offered to go to work for the church, for the Diocese of Liverpool. She took, I think, some serious financial sacrifices to do that, and was willing to go ahead and try to see what she could do. She's been working now in that ministry for 8 years, so she's 31 years old. She got an early start on this thing. And her job, she works in a pastoral team. She works with a priest and some other people, trying to enable lay people to learn how to work in collaborative ministry to build up the church. Now she starts out in her talk, and she says, I do not belong to any organization, lay movement, or institute. I'm an ordinary lay person and content to be so. So she sees herself as, doing very ordinary things in one sense. She's not the president of anything. In fact, she doesn't officially belong to any other kind of groupings. She's just trying to do her job as a Christian in the world and to serve the Diocese of Liverpool. Then she goes on, she says, but as I greet you as Synod Fathers, so you got this picture of these lay people there and this big sea of bishops. As I greet you as Synod Fathers, I would like to add brothers. For this reason, I want to greet you as my brothers, she said. She says, one important thing I've learned working along with priests, bishops, religious, and other people is that when I speak of the church, I can say we. She goes on to say she's learned to avoid the language of us, them. She's had with this language of we. So she says she does not come there in opposition to these people, but as a friend and as a sister to people. She's sort of insistent to call them brothers and just fathers. So we see a certainness here. It might remind us of the woman out in San Francisco. Help me, Don. Oh, I always forget her name. Who spoke up to the no one's remembering. Memory's so fleeting. This was so courageous. She spoke up to the Pope when he was here in his visit in San Francisco and said to him, I'm an adult, and I should be treated like an adult. So immediately, what Patricia is just challenging the clericalism that was present at the Synod. As we see, as we go along here, she was not very successful. Because, as a matter of fact, the clericalism in the church just overwhelmed people like Patricia Jones in the Synod. That was the way many of the people understood what went wrong. Clericalism rampant. Clericalism dominating the whole scene and not allowing for any real dialogue to go on in the Synod. That's what many people feel anyway about it. So Patricia, though, is going to fight this in the first week. She addresses them as her brothers and expects them to accord her a certain respect as she goes along with all of that. She says, I have learned that together we can share responsibility, criticism, and praise. So her hope is, as she starts, that no one will see her in opposition, but we share the same hopes, the same weaknesses, and most important of all, telling praise, the same dedication. So she won't allow that these people here, these bishops, somehow are superior to her in dedication. That they've sort of given their whole life to this thing and have embraced this celibate status and so on, and that therefore they're somehow more dedicated than she is. She won't buy that. She says no, that she brings an equal dedication to them in this whole business of carrying on the mission of the church. So now that's an interesting sort of framework that she sets here. It tells us a lot about the perception of the church that many people have today, in which laity and the church are co-responsible. And as our bishops, the motto they took with them, the four elected ones, was that we are pushing for co-discipleship in the church. That became their way of summarizing what they heard from 200,000 people in the United States about their wishes, hopes, desires for the church, that let's produce a co-discipleship so that we are all followers of Christ together and carrying out this mission. So there is an ecclesiology that Patricia has learned from all of this. There's a way of looking at the world and at the church that she's going to insist on here. It is a model of the church that refuses to see it as a pyramid and wants to see it as a community of people who are responsible for it, who live in a certain pluralism, and try to form genuine mutual relationships within that church. So behind this, she isn't just speaking in a vacuum. She's speaking stuff she learned in her experience, but also the kind of theology she was able to learn. She would not settle for an institutional model of the church. She's insisting on a communal model here. Okay, let me just stop there and see if there's any questions. As you can see, what I want to do is to tell you the story of the laity through her eyes and to sort of fill you in on what was going on in that way. Create maybe a bit of mood around this synod. Does anybody want to ask me anything up to this point? Yeah.
The other lay people, they were not in at synod. They were actually outside of the bishop's inside.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, and the very composition of them and so on is important. They were inside listening. They were called the auditors, the listeners. Not all of them were allowed to speak, like Patricia. That was an exception. They were there to listen. They could not vote, and they had a very interesting composition. It was an extremely conservative group of lay people, by and large. I mean, there were exceptions. I should have pointed that out. Patricia was not the ordinary one there. The people appointed very often were the heads of very conservative groups or had rather traditional notions of the church and so on. In fact, for the most part, the synod was sort of stacked that way. While the bishops' conferences could elect who they wanted, and our bishops elected quite a liberal slate, Cardinal Bernardine usually being thought of as the leader of the liberal element in the Catholic Church in the United States, Bishop May being a moderate, and Bishop Weakland being more liberal than most of the bishops. And I really don't know about Bishop Ott. I don't know where he's at in all of this. Although he had nice things to say about Patricia and what she had in her comments, as we'll see as we go along. But those people were in there. They could not vote. At the end, after the small group discussions, and they came up with these resolutions, they voted on them. But they were not allowed to vote. I think there's something else that should be said right away here, is that the synod was conducted in almost total secrecy. There were no reporters allowed in. And in fact, they were not allowed to share the material. The bishops were told at one point that it would be a mortal sin for them to Xerox their materials and to give it out to other people. So there was a total media blackout of this thing. And some things that people, just resented tremendously after the openness of the Second Vatican Council and so on. The reason given for this was that if the media got hold of the material, that it would put undue pressure on the Pope to respond to what he was given. In fact, it would have been hard for Patricia to read it if she could have got a hold of it. Incidentally, even the auditors weren't allowed to have the written copies. But it was in Latin, so unless Patricia was unusual and happened to know Latin, she probably wouldn't have been able to read it anyway. The interesting stories are, as most things happen over there, is that you could buy this material out in the streets of Rome. It was quite accessible if you wanted to pay the money. So the secrecy, it showed sort of some of the foolishness of the secrecy. I'm flashing on a conference, I've talked about this before, when I was in Washington with the so-called Moonies and the Unification Church and the Hare Krishna people and so on. Monsignor George Higgins, a great veteran of the Catholic movements in the United States, got up and warned them about the mistakes of surrounding secrecy. These movements very often are secret, as you know, and hard to know what they're really about. And Monsignor Higgins made a very clear statement that the Catholic Church has learned over a long period of time that secrecy doesn't work, and you just end up making yourself look foolish. Well, they had forgotten that message in Rome at this synod during the month of October and tried to keep it secret, making the press angry and increasing the black market in Xerox copies of the materials that were given out. But in answer, a rather conservative group of lay people, I would say, from what I've been able to discern. Yeah.
You said that bishops like Wheatland and Bernardine had their own liberal slate. What happened to them? Who decided on the final 60 auditors?
That was decided, as far as I know, by Rome. I could be wrong with that, but I think that at least they appointed a good number of lay people. They ended up appointing a good number of people in the synod, and a number of them were the curial officials, the Roman bureaucrats. And one of the bishops who was most disappointed with the synod said that he felt like every time they got up, they were just lecturing the bishops from around the United States, or from around the world. They weren't interested in what these other bishops had to say, but from their own Roman viewpoint, they were lecturing them on how they should be thinking about what was going on.
These were lay people?
No, these would have been the curial cardinals and bishops. But I think that Rome had a great say in the lay people who were there. Yes. Yep. Well, Patricia Jones. No, they were not allowed to speak during this synod. To listen. That's why they were officially called auditors. Lay auditors. Now, they might have had their chance, and I'm not saying Patricia was the only one. There might have been other lay people who had the chance to address the group. But by and large, they couldn't vote on the materials, and so on. Remember, the purpose of the synod, backtrack a little, and that's exactly how I intended to do this whole thing, to fill in as we go along. The synods were established after the Second Vatican Council as the way of implementing the collegial model in the church. So it was thought that every 3 years, a group of bishops from around the world would get together and would discuss. They wouldn't produce necessarily the documents themselves, although on 2 occasions they have, but that they would give the material to the Pope, and then he would take it and write what they call an apostolic exhortation on it. And that's what he's doing now. Some of the liberals are saying the only chance for this synod to be saved in any way at this point is if the Pope takes the very bland 50 or so resolutions given to him and does something creative with them. So it's totally up to him. So here's our collegial model. That this is the way we've implemented collegiality in one sense. So we have a moderate democratic process. In other words, the bishops in the United States are able to elect who they want to send over there. But then the Pope got, I think, geez, this is a little vague to me, but he might have got 3 or 4 of his own appointments also to go over. So the Vatican could always counter any bishops' conference if they didn't like the composition by getting a more conservative grouping from that country to come to the synod. So the whole idea of it being sort of democratic and it simply is not there. And so you've got silence, no opportunity to know what's going on. The lay people, who the synod is all about, are not getting their voice heard directly in the council. Then the bishops are saying that one Canadian bishop went home, and not many of the bishops spoke out really forthrightly, but this one did. And it just talked about the synod as being a total disappointment, that they didn't listen to anything they had to say, and that all this work with the lay people and all this background simply went for naught, because the grassroots wasn't even heard. I would tell you the leakage on the propositions given to the Pope, in fact, supposedly have totally deleted the women's question. And that was Archbishop Weakland's major contribution at the beginning, where they said that all the non-ordained offices ought to be open to women. I'm going to talk about this probably in greater detail in other nights, so I shouldn't go into that too much. I'll be talking more specifically later on about that. But just to show you that the process didn't work, that all this stuff that they hoped to get in there about women's rights in the church and the anger and frustration of women really didn't get into the final material given to the Pope that he's going to write his document out of. Oh, this highlights my point about the title of this lecture tonight is Laity and Hope in the Church. Gabriel Marcel once said that you cannot know hope unless you've known despair. That's the motto I'm taking for tonight's lecture. Yes.
Is the democracy in the Senate patterned after the democracy in Poland?
And I didn't hear the last part.
I was wondering if the democracy in this Bishop Synod was patterned after the democracy in Poland.
It might have a certain flavor of that, yes. The democracy in Poland is the model. I think that much of the way the Pope views the church, of course, is, like all of us, shaped by our culture and the society in which we grew up. That's unavoidable. We see the church through the eyes of American experience. He sees it through the eyes of the Polish experience. Yeah, I think there would be certain probably similarities there.
Except that Poland is not a democracy. It's a communist country.
Yes.
Some Polish people in Poland would argue that.
I have family in Poland. They would argue in the district.
Well, I'm sure, but what I'm saying is there will be arguments on both sides of that question. I agree with your statement 100%.
It reinforces the point. I mean, that we've got an authoritarian model here that's at work in the whole Senate. Okay. Now I want to go on with our story of our 31-year-old church worker from Liverpool, England, who is addressing these bishops here and insisting that they are her brothers and that they have the same dedication to the church and so on. Now, she has 4 points to make. In her first point, she's to talk about the formation of lay people to live in the life of the church. So she says, my first point is about the purpose of formation. Let me give an example. I think of one particular single parent living in derelict housing. That's the word she used for her neighborhood, around derelict housing. Reflecting in a formation group, so you get a single woman in a group, like a prayer group or an action group, Christian group. So they're sitting there reading the scriptures, and she says they read this gospel story of Lazarus, whom Jesus unbound from death. While this woman is hearing this story, she realized that her struggle to be rehoused, find decent housing, was another kind of unbinding to which that word of God also speaks. She was sustained and challenged by that word. That is how formation begins. Now, instructive point, the way Patricia begins her whole approach to talking about addressing the group, because it stands in stark contrast to many of the other interventions in the council, which began not from some sort of experience with living out the gospel, but began with certain theological principles and then tried to apply them. So we saw right in the synod, in the very methodology of the people who addressed the group, 2 very different approaches. One set of people there said, we've got to get down and look at the experience of lay people here in around the world. We got to see how they're really living out the gospel and what are they doing. And let's try to build on that and understand it. You notice how the woman was in a bad situation, bad housing. She reads the gospel. She finds inspiration in that and some sort of guidance. And then that is what Patricia says, that's where her formation began, is this interweaving of the scriptures with her real life situation, which wasn't all that happy or good. Now, the Roman theologians and the more conservative theologians there, what I like to call the classicists, began very differently. They addressed the synod by starting out by saying things like, well, the church has taught this or that about ministry. This is what the theological textbooks say about ministry, giving us a very different approach. Now, what it appears happened in the synod is that the classicists overran the approach of the contemporary people, that their methodology won out, so that many people felt that this real experience of how people were living out the Christian faith in real life simply was lost, not appreciated. It wasn't the methodology that finally shaped the ongoing life of this synod. So Patricia represented an approach of contemporary theology here, and one that unfortunately, I would say, failed to really grab hold and to shape the whole purpose of this synod. She goes on to say, formation takes place when people realize that faith and life are inseparable. What she was after was to try to overcome a lot of the so-called dualisms that afflict Christians trying to live today. She goes on in talking about it. I just tell you a few more things and go back to this dualism. Formation is about releasing in people the power which is within them, not something from up above. The purpose of formation is to enable people to live their ordinary lives in the world as the mission given them by Christ. She says, I asked the synod to present an integrated theological vision of the unity of the sacred and the secular. Our lives are the place where the sacred and the secular are inseparable, and the place of our work for God's kingdom. Okay. So that becomes one of her major pleas, that the problem for lay people in the world is the separation. There are a lot of dichotomies, dualisms that are plaguing the efforts of lay people to live effectively. One is this separation of the sacred and the secular. Oh, that the problem is that what does church on Sunday have to do with going to work on Monday? Well, how do we put those together? And she's calling upon the church fathers there, or her brothers in the synod, to recognize that, to try to put those together. And you notice how she has an answer to it, of how this all really works. See, it's our lives are the place where the sacred and the secular are separable. You can step back and theorize and say, well, there's the world out there, and that's the place of the devil and temptation, or that's a place where dog-eat-dog rules, and you sort of do the best you can there, and then you come home to your safe haven of the family where there's real Christian values, or you go to church where you really can worship God. Oh, that kind of dualism she wants to overcome. And she says, well, how do you overcome it? Well, you can't look at it like that. You can't step back objectively and try to see two different worlds like that. They come together in our lives. We are both Christians and citizens. No, we're both worshipers and workers. We have to put that together in the very way we live. So Patricia is interested in getting integration in her understanding of life. She's interested in overcoming other dualisms as well, the dualism between the clergy and the laity. So as we'll see later on here, she talks about collaborative ministry, and she doesn't want this separated out like the priests are up here and they got their job, and here are the lay people down here, and there's no real connection between them. That became, again, one of the great arguing points in the Synod, is how much are we going to stress the distinction between lay people and priests, between the ordained and the non-ordained, between those who share in the universal priesthood of Christ and those who share in what is commonly called the ministerial priesthood. And Patricia clearly comes down on the side of saying, let's not emphasize that distinction. Let's not keep them like this. Let's find a deeper way of rooting them and finding a unity. Let's overcome that kind of dualism. Then she goes on, and this is all her first point yet, and that is she wants to talk about the purpose of formation. Why are we trying to study and learn and so on? Why is all of this? It is in her mind, to enable us to live our ordinary lives in the world as the mission given us by Christ. Then she says, and I would ask for a word of affirmation. This is a tremendous talk. Obviously, I chose this for a reason. I consider this to be an outstanding talk. Again, I would ask for a word of affirmation for the countless ordinary and small ways in which lay people struggle to live faith in the world. That struggle, in its failures and its fruits, is the very life of the church and the hope for the world. So she wants the Synod now to recognize the importance of the daily struggles of trying to work and meet one's responsibilities and raise a family and study and learn and teach and all of the other things that make up our lives. She wants the Synod to recognize this. She wants these bishops to get involved in that real world, understand what it's really like there, and affirm the people, the ordinary people, so they feel like the church is with them and supporting them in this whole process. Okay, again, I'm going to stop. Patricia has 4 major points here, which are going to guide my whole presentation. I'm going to stop there again and see if anyone wants to ask me about any part of that. Or any other questions about the Synod in general that strike you. Yes?
Were the procedures of this Synod similar to the previous one before this?
I believe that if my memory serves me correctly, that the previous synods had a similar structure, but they weren't done in secrecy. And I think that maybe the small group discussions was a new innovation too. At least some of the previous synods didn't do it that way. So this going into small language, which I think was new. But the secrecy, I mean, it was really a step backward. The way things had been done before, at least in my opinion.
You said 200,000 people were interrogated or questioned or surveyed or whatever. What happened to the input?
Well, that input in the United States was boiled down and put into workable form for our 4 bishops representing the other bishops' conferences. They went there and they had their say. As I say, their summary of what they had heard from all the people was contained in that word that we must push for co-discipleship in the church. Then it got specified. Rembert Weekland, for example, was in charge of talking to women's issues. And it's very strange. I don't know what to make of that. He did have his say in the first week. And he did, as you know, he spoke out very courageously when the Pope was here, and talked very directly about the anger and the resentment of women, and told the Pope in no uncertain terms about what the American women were feeling and what we needed to do about it and so on. My impression is, although we don't have don't catch all the flavor, my impression was his message in the Synod was slightly more muted than that. But he did get his say in. I mean, he pushed for as much as they thought they could get. That is, the problem was that the Pope had said you cannot talk about the ordination of women. That's been off limits since the word go. So all of them kept trying to figure out how can we work this in. One bishop from, I want to say Canada, said that, no, I think this is Belgium or something in Europe, said that maybe we could set up a study group to look at some of this. I mean, it's sort of an oblique way. Someone else suggested that, well, maybe we could investigate the possibility of women being ordained deacons. And Weekland got in his thing that said that they wanted to make the church's official policy that all of the non-ordained ministries would be open to women. Now, as you might know now, they're not. The ministries of acolyte and lector are not. And the acolyte one gets enforced some places. That's why girls can't be servers. And that became a real symbol for the council, for those who were fighting for reform. It was something like this, that if we can't even get them to give us girl servers, which is so obviously in line with what ought to happen, then, I mean, we're no place. Show you how the council was composed. Joseph Fessio, a very conservative theologian from the United States out in San Francisco, was given the job of, or wrote, I think I shouldn't have said he didn't give him the job, but he wrote a defense against girl servers, and saying why we should not have them. And he said his argument was that to have girl servers would simply set up an expectation then that the girls could be priests, and that his words that it sent a false signal to the feminists around the world that having these girl servers. So it was sort of the domino theory in a way applied to this situation. But Joseph Fessio, I mean, to be chosen as one of the theologians for this synod is an interesting choice just in itself. Anyway, what was I saying? I was trying to... What was I answering? Some had a point with all of that. Did someone ask me a question, or have I just been rambling?
What happened?
Oh, yeah, what happened in, but Rembert Weekland, yes, Rembert Weekland, and his job was to talk about the women. And he said, women, all the non-ordained ministries ought to be open to women. Now, I mean, geez, if you got in a synod on the Laity, I mean, if you can't get there, you got to wonder, I mean, where are we at? That's not even to begin to talk about women being ordained priests. That's just, and officially, I mean, we have women who are lectors in the United States here, but evidently that really isn't allowed at some sort of international level. I don't remember that myself, but that's one of the things they kept arguing in the Synod. I guess we're just so used to it that we take it for granted. But they wanted to open up lector and acolyte to women. And Weekland made his points, but I mean, geez, that's a minor point. And our other bishops, I think our bishops had their say. I mean, as near as I can figure, the bishops did try to tell the Synod what the Catholic lay people in the United States were thinking. And that they wanted more participation and democratic procedures and so on. I think they did their job as near as I can figure. Yeah. Yeah, I will. That was said by Roger Mahoney, the bishop in Los Angeles. There's a theory about this, which I will give you the background to. When the Pope was in the United States, and he was responding to people who had talked all about lay ministry, he never used that word. Never. He almost, I don't know, I won't say that he never has used it, but he very seldom uses it. And there is a feeling that to begin to talk about lay ministry, and that's, I'm going to make that one whole section when I lecture, maybe next week or the following week. So I don't want to go into the whole thing, but just the terminology. The Pope doesn't use that language, and a lot of people fear that language because they see it as a way of lay people getting sort of equal with the ministerial priests. And they want to say, the Pope always uses the word mission, that lay people in the church share in the mission of Christ, in the mission of the church. He doesn't talk about lay ministry. So, Bishop Mahoney from Los Angeles gets up, interestingly enough, he's a papal-appointed spokesman for the United States, gets up and gives this talk and saying that the very phrase lay ministry is a bad one, that it's self-contradictory, and that we ought to be talking about the mission of lay people. That's very interesting. Intervention on his part, given what we know about the Pope's own outlook on that question. Anyway, that viewpoint was immediately responded to by Bishop May, who is the president of the American Bishops in the United States. He's from St. Louis. And Bishop May said publicly in a press conference outside of that he defended lay ministry and talked about all the good things that have happened with lay ministry, and that's one of the great joys of the church and one of the great advances that we've made. So you had, that was part of the debate that went on. I'm inclined to take a 5-minute break at this time, and I intend to end. Yes, sir.
A little clarification. When you were talking about lector and acolyte, were you talking about turning the lector, turning the acolyte on the road to becoming a priest or deacon, or were you talking about extraordinary ministry?
The question is asked, and I said talking acolyte lector, is I talking about the orders leading up to priesthood or of the kind of thing open to lay ministers? That became a debatable point at the council, at the synod, and I am talking about it as the extraordinary ministries, as you talked about it, that would be generally open to people who are not moving on to priesthood. That is the basis for the discussion at the synod. However, some people thought, well, we'll solve this problem by saying, well, these are steps to the priesthood, and therefore the only people who could do them are people eligible to go on to the priesthood, and restrict it to that. That was one of the conservative interventions in the council. In the synod, I don't think that will be carried.
Yeah, because at one point I thought they would want to understand I thought in the early days of lay ministry that a person could go to become just a term of acolyte and term of lector for the rest of their life. They didn't have to go on and become a deacon or a priest. Stop there or let them become deacon. This is a question I thought I was having some time back, a few years ago. The other thing, question I have, wasn't the concept coming out of Vatican II that we would change from a hierarchical structure to a faith community and call people out of that to church, or am I wrong?
Yeah, let me repeat that. This is well said. The statement is made, was it not true that in the Second Vatican Council that we began to talk about the church as the whole people of God, and that out of that community some people would be called to serve? And as a matter of fact, that is contained in the second chapter of the document on the church, Lumen Gentium, and one of the 16 council documents. But the problem at the council, and the problem that has continued to plague us ever since, is that the third chapter, after they talked about the people of God in chapter 2, said all those beautiful things that a lot of liberal people like, they went to chapter 3 and talked about the hierarchical structure and the role of bishops and so on, and it sounded so different. In other words, what happened at the council was you had two distinct theologies there. This is back in the 60s, from 62 to 65, Second Vatican Council, which produced 16 documents, one of the major ones being Lumen Gentium, the document on the church, so that the two theologies that were fighting and contending at the council could not come up with a synthesis. There was no way to amalgamate them, so they sit there side by side. So ever since the council, what we've had is the opportunity for anybody to go back to that document and choose either chapter to buttress their own opinion. So we've continued to have that fight going on all the way up to our own time. And as one judges in general, you see the communal model, the people of God image, sort of gradually, I think, gaining ground. But you also see the institutional model, the hierarchical pyramidal image, still at work. And people can call upon it at any point. And there's a lot of feeling that the current Holy Father really holds that whole thing. The Holy Father, when he was a cardinal in 79, is that before he became the Pope? Anyway, right, somewhere in there, said that he thought the most important statement made, and the whole essence of the ecclesiology given by the council was contained in the statement that in the one priesthood there is this essential difference between the ordained and the universal priesthood of the laity. He's on record as saying that. I mean, that was, and of course we all say, if you talk long enough, you say stupid things. And whether, push to that, well, I'd say this, he's never repudiated it as far as I know. I mean, everyone's had their favorite phrase out of the council. I mean, Karl Rahner said the most important sentence in that document was that the church is the sacrament of the kingdom. Church is to be the sign and the witness to the kingdom of God. He thought that was the most important. So everyone's got their favorite statement. But for the Pope to say his favorite statement is the one that makes the essential, that it's not that statement that he said it is not a difference of degree between the universal priesthood and the ordained priesthood, but an essential difference. Not a difference of degree. To him, that contained the nub of the ecclesiology in the council. So you can see that chapter 3 was more important to him than chapter 2. And you're able to pick up any part of that you want. Yes? Don't know that. I suspect that Cardinal Hume had a lot to do with that. I don't know that. And again, I don't know how many other lay people got to address the council. I mean the Synod. I keep saying council, then Synod. I don't know that. But it certainly wasn't all 60 of them. Maybe there was a few others. I don't know that. But they picked a good one. I suspect Cardinal Hume pushed in there. I mean, this is the kind of statement that looks like it was gone over very carefully. It has a great economy of words and many things beautifully stated. I mean, it isn't the kind of thing that a single individual would sit down and write out in a half hour. One has the impression that it was finely honed some way. Yeah. I'm having in my mind that it was positive, and I probably read some news report on it, and that it brought some spontaneous applause or something, but it's vague to me. Not sure. Let me go on to her second point here. She says, my second point is about the place of formation. and begins with another picture. She's very good at imagery and getting her point. My parish church in the inner city of Liverpool is surrounded on three sides by a tobacco factory, and in front by some apartments, half lived in, half derelict. For me, that symbolizes the way in which the parish, through its people and its situation, is rooted in the world and has a mission there. It is close to the suffering and joys not only of the baptized, but of the whole neighborhood. So she's beginning by telling us that where are we going to form people? As you'll see, there's a big argument behind this. She was really clued in to what was going on in the synod, to the background fights. Again, I don't know how that happened, but she understood, because let me just say what the background of this is. There was a major fight at the synod between the people involved in the so-called movements. Two major ones, communion and liberation, which I think grew up in Milan, Italy. I'm locating it back in the 1950s. Yeah, 1954, I think. And another one that's better known to people, that is Opus Dei, which is already operative in Franco Spain in the 30s and dominated Spanish politics in the 70s. Now, these are two strong right-wing organizations. They are strongly anti-communist. They are very centralized, strong authoritarian structure. They are totally loyal to the Pope, at least to the present one. They are insistent that Catholics involved in the political order establish Catholic principles. I could put it this way. I think it was Rembert Weakland who said these groups amounted to, in the long run, nothing but a Catholic moral majority. Jerry Falwell, moral majority, established Christendom in the United States. It's a throwback to the time before John Courtney Murray and the time of Leo XIII at the turn of the century, and throughout some of the 20th century, where it was thought that if Catholics were the majority in any country, that they would have to establish a privileged position for the Catholic Church. And as we know, in the United States, we have adopted another position, that we do not desire privilege, we simply desire freedom. And in fact, the Second Vatican Council also stated that the church in any culture, even if it is the majority, does not demand privilege, but desires freedom. In a sense, as we flourish for that. Well, Opus Dei and Communion and Liberation, strong right-wing organizations, have a very different viewpoint of all of that. The leaders of both Opus Dei and current leaders and of Communion and Liberation were among the official lay representatives among the official representatives at the council, papal appointed. The Pope speaks very favorably about these strong right-wing organizations. One of the bishops leaving the council said that the synod, might as well just factor that in, leaving the synod said that the bishops now going back home would be under tremendous pressure from these right-wing organizations, who would be able to easily report them to the Vatican for what they do wrong. In fact, that's one of the theories of where the pressure comes upon liberal bishops in the United States, is from these organizations. There are some strong statements by high Vatican officials. In fact, one very frightening statement, that he thought it would be good if these groups took over the whole campus ministry in the United States. And in fact, there's thought that Cardinal O'Connor wants to implement that in the New York area. There's a lot of rumors that Opus Dei people, well, they do buy houses near the campuses and have tried to infiltrate the campus ministry. Now, these things are generally the code phrase in the council, the synod, was the movements. These are called the lay movements. Now, we got a lot of other lay movements that some of us would be happier with. The marriage encounter, Curcio, and Christ Renews His Parish, and a whole bunch of other movement kind of things. But the argument in the synod, and one that the Pope will be deciding in this apostolic exhortation in 6 months, is who controls those movements? What they have effectively done, Opus Dei, to take an example, is bypass the bishops and move to the Pope to get the Pope's permission for anything they want to do, thus bypassing the bishops and being able to carry out their mission as they see it. So the thing at the synod was, where, as Patricia said it, where is the formation going to happen and who's going to control it? Is it going to be done by movements that are outside the control of the local pastor and outside the control of the local bishop or even the national hierarchies? Or will it be within the structure of the church as we know it in the parish and in the diocese? And this is major resolutions made along that line sent to the bishops. My own reading of it is that in some ways it's a standoff. I know that one of the news reports said that Communion and Liberation Movement got exactly what they wanted from the synod, the kind of official approval they want to be able to carry out their whole operation. Patricia, obviously aware of this problem, makes it clear that the formation must go on in the parish, be located there. I would make a plea for the synod to affirm the parish as the proper home and source of formation. I do so for 3 reasons. The parish can reach out and evangelize